Hi guys, how you all doing? Busy day for us journalists in the North East today because Newcastle announced their financial results for year ending June 2023. So we had a briefing with Darren Eales, the club's chief executive, and also the club's financial officer Simon Capper as well this morning, just to talk us through the outcome from those financial results which were posted today, and to talk about what that means for the football club moving forward. But of course, as you would all imagine, it's January, the transfer window is open, and a lot of the questions today from us guys, us journalists who were in on the briefing, centred around the January transfer window and moving forward into the summer as well. So look, there was a lot to get through today, a lot of information. There's a lot of sort of smaller points that I'll leave out of this, and a lot of parts that probably could be quite confusing to tell. So I've just broken it down into what I thought were the main points today, and I'll obviously try and explain what or how Darren Eales discussed the situation and what Darren Eales' thinking was, because as well as being provided with the financial results, we also got an opportunity to interview the two of them as well. So they got their thoughts on the situation, and we were able to present them with some questions. So as sure as most of you will have noticed, Newcastle posted a turnover today of £250 million. So that's the amount of money that they've brought in over that year. So June 2022 to end of June 2023, which is 70 million, 70 up on the results the previous year. So so as far as the club are concerned, that is a steady improvement on revenue coming into the club, a 39% growth in terms of revenue increase, should I say. So a fairly sizable difference. The club posted a loss of £73 million, which is similar to that of last year. I think it was maybe just over £70 million. So as far as the club are concerned, a comfortable loss in that it's within the rules of profit and sustainability, which is essentially what governs the entire financial situation revolving around football clubs at the moment. And I suppose you've got to take into account that of that loss of £73 million, that £157 million, according to the financial figures, was spent in players in that financial year. So from the end of June 2022 to the end of June 2023, the club, according to their books, spent £157 million on players. Now, this wasn't the Tonali, Lewis Hall and Tino Livramento summer. This is going back to the previous summer. Sven Botman, Nick Pope, Alexander Isak all arrived. Remember Isak arriving for a club record transfer. And also Anthony Gordon the following January, who arrived for £45 million with some add-ons as well. So 157 million spent over the course of those two windows, over the course of that financial year, which has been offset, of course, by revenue brought into the club. So the £250 million turnover brought in by Newcastle is significantly larger, as I say, than previous years, £70 million more than the last financial year, up 39%, but still significantly behind all of the top six clubs. What it's done is it's positioned Newcastle now above the rest. So their turnover is now bigger than West Ham, for example. It's bigger than Aston Villa, but it's less than the top six clubs. And when I say the top six, it's the so-called top six, which of course includes Chelsea and Tottenham Hotspur. I mean, you look at Spurs' turnover last year, 2022, they've not posted the results yet for the 2023 year, and their turnover was 444 million. So compare that to Newcastle's 250 million, and it shows how far Newcastle have got to try and close the gap and be up there and seen as one of the top six clubs in terms of what they spend and what they spend in wages and player purchases, etc. And then Newcastle's turnover is dwarfed by Manchester City's. Their results this year, 2023, they posted a £713 million turnover, so almost 3 times as much as what Newcastle brought in. And you've got to look forward to next year's results for Manchester City as well, who of course will post an even bigger turnover than that, given the fact that they not just reached but won the Champions League. So that just gives you an idea as to how far Newcastle have got to try and catch these top 6 clubs. And as Eddie Howe says, sorry about that, I got a little bit distracted there by my new puppy, who is 5 for 5 days in the background, just being a bit of a pest. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, so you've got to look forward to next year, where Manchester City, of course, are going to post an even bigger turnover due to the fact that they won the Champions League. So that just gives you an idea as to the kind of gulf between Newcastle and the top Premier League clubs in terms of the revenue, the amount of money they bring in commercial deals that Newcastle need to get to for them to become, as Darren Eales said today, a sustainable top 6 Premier League club. Now, as I've said earlier, the revenue increase is at 39%, but the good news for Newcastle and for the club's owners is that doesn't take into account any deals that are on the way. So for example, the seller front of shirt deal is £25 million a year. That has not been taken into account, so that will come into play in next year's results. Also, the club are very excited about Adidas being their being their kit manufacturer moving forward as well. So there'll be a large sum of money from that, and of course the club can then control their own merchandise, which apparently they're very looking forward to. Darren Eales said so. That's something that will bring in further revenue, and of course that doesn't take into account the Champions League prize money, which sits at £37 million for qualifying and competing in those 6 games. Now, had Newcastle qualified out of the group stages and into the knockout stages, they would have got a significantly bigger sum of money. So disappointing for the club in terms of that, because that could have been money put towards another signing. What Darren Eales did say today is that the owners are, of course, fully supportive of the club, as we've been made aware for a long time now, and that they'll put maximum amount of revenue, amount of finance into the club under the FFP and PSR rules. So it sounds as though they're backing him to the hilt as far as they can go. And as I've been saying in a number of lives over on Sky Sports News of late, Newcastle are very, very close to the limits in terms of financial fair play, and that's something that Eddie Howe said at a number of press conferences. Both Dan Ashworth and Darren Eales have now reflected that information to us as well. I mean, these rules, these financial fair play rules, the profit and sustainability rules, they're there to stop clubs going bust. But I think for Newcastle, it's a frustration, because they've obviously got the wealthiest owners in the world, but they just can't use all that money because of these rules that have been put in place. So they're supposed to stop, as I say, clubs going to the wall, clubs overspending who can't afford it. But what it's really doing, essentially, from the outside looking in, is handcuffing clubs like Newcastle, who have got the money there to spend, but are now governed by these laws and these rules that were not in place when the Man City takeover went through, when the Chelsea takeover went through. So for the PIF, they just come in at a later stage. And look, as Darren said today, they were well aware of the situation when the club was taken over, and it's just something that they're having to manage, and it's a situation that they're having to, I suppose, learn from as they go along. Now, the main talking point from today's briefing was transfers, of course. We're in the January transfer window, and we as journalists were keen to know, like you guys are as fans, what Newcastle plan to do, what they're trying to do this January, and then moving forward into the summer as well, given the fact that they are close to their financial fair play guidelines. And Darren Eales was very open and honest, and almost giving a little bit of a warning to the supporters, I think, through us, that Newcastle are going to have to trade in the medium-term future so that they can continue to reinvest money in the squad and bring big-name players to the football club. He was asked the direct question, does every player in the world of financial fair play have their price? And he said yes. He said, look, if a ridiculous offer came in for one of our players, then of course we would have to consider it, because it can then allow the club to enter back into the transfer market with more money to spend. And the reason for that is amortisation, and this is something that Darren Eales, should I say, has spoken to us about a couple of times. So what essentially happens is, or how he explained it, I'll try and explain it as well as he did, but essentially if Newcastle have a player who's worth a profit of 50 million. So let's take Bruno Guimaraes, for example, was bought for 40 million pounds. Say, for example, Newcastle sold him for 90 million. Newcastle make a profit of 50 million on that player. If they then bought a player for 50 million on the exact same wages, people would look at that and say, why are you doing that? You've got a player there, he's doing well for you, this is a gamble. But what then happens is Newcastle can spread that transfer over 5 years, spending £10 million a year, which in turn gives them an extra £40 million to use in the transfer market, headroom he called it. So what they can do is they can bring players in and amortise their transfer over a longer period of their contract. I've seen it with Chelsea recently, who have been doing 8 and 9 year contracts, although as we know that has since been capped and they can only do up to 5 years, I think. And it gives the club, the buying club, an advantage. So they can only do this by trading and by selling players at the same time. So that is why the likes of a Bruno Guimaraes and Alexander Isak, Sven Botman could be sold in the medium term future to allow the club to then reinvest in 2-3 players. That is why Alan St-Maximin was sold last summer, and that's why if a big offer came in for one of their academy products, so say for example Sean Longstaff, that would be the perfect scenario for Newcastle if a big enough offer came in for him, because he is an academy product. So any offer that came in for him would be pure profit. So for example, if someone came in and offered £30 million for Sean Longstaff, then that £30 million would be pure profit that Newcastle could then use against a purchase, and it can be amortised over the 5 years, and it would give them an extra amount of money to spend in each of these financial years. So it's quite a confusing situation, and there's a lot of moving parts to it, to coin an Eddie Howe phrase there. But it's quite understandable why Newcastle would look to do that in the medium term future. Now, I don't think they're going to do that in January. In fact, I would say it's almost certain they will not do that in January. I think he's just paving the way slightly for potential for something to come in the summer, or maybe at this time next year. And what he did is he used the examples of Aston Villa, who of course sold Jack Grealish, and then reinvested in the likes of Diego Carlos at the back, Moussa Diaby, a load of different players, and they've brought a number of different players in to replace that one player. We've seen the same, as he said, with Declan Rice at West Ham, and they signed a number of players in the summer, in the likes of Kudus and Alvarez and Ward-Prowse, and they're using that money as profit to then amortise transfers moving forward, and they're using it to their advantage. What other clubs? He said Liverpool a few years ago, they sold Coutinho and then brought in Virgil van Dijk and Alisson, and they were able to get their way around FFP as a result of that. So that is obviously something Newcastle are going to have to look to do, to trade, to grow as a football club, alongside bringing in commercial revenue, which of course will increase as the years go on, but just looking at it, we can clearly see that they're quite far behind Manchester City, Spurs, Chelsea, Arsenal, Manchester United, who are bringing in, as I've touched on already, 2-3 times as much revenue as what Newcastle United are, still 2 years after the takeover. In terms of the takeover, you will remember Amanda Staveley sitting down and speaking to myself and other journalists the day that the takeover went through, and she claimed that she wanted Newcastle to win the Premier League within 5 to 10 years. Now, Darren Eales has rode back on that slightly today by saying what the aim is and the ambition is for Newcastle to be a sustainable top 6 Premier League club in the future. Now, of course, they were that last season. Not at the moment, sitting down in 10th place in the Premier League, but the aim is to be one of the top 6, sustainable top 6 Premier League club. So to do that, he says, we need to ensure that we're up there in that top 6 in terms of the revenue that we bring into the club, and then in turn are able to spend that on transfers and wages moving forwards. So I asked him the direct question, how long will it be until Newcastle are there? And although he couldn't give a time scale, he said, look, it's not a straight road from A to B. There's going to be bumps in the road, there's going to be things that change that. And looking at it now, Newcastle being in the Champions League this year has probably knocked the club back a little bit, because it came ahead of schedule, and perhaps they weren't at a strong enough moment in their evolution in terms of their squad and numbers that they've got. We've seen the injury list, they struggled to deal with the schedule, and I think that's probably because it's come a bit too early. But listen, that's all in the back of Eddie Howe and the players doing such an amazing job last season, and credit to them for that. But it's put Newcastle back on the map. I would imagine it's helped with revenue coming into the club. In fact, Darren Eales said that is the case. But it just means it doesn't feel like it's a sheer upward trajectory. There's a little bit of a bump in the road on the back of that. And Newcastle at this moment in time are just trying to manage that bump in the road and ensure that it's not going to be catastrophic or anything that's going to knock them off their course too much. So I think the hope is that result against Sunderland at the weekend will just focus minds, and Newcastle once they get Man City and Aston Villa out of the way, you've got a favourable run of fixtures that might get them hopefully back up the league again. And there's sort of one phrase that stuck out today from what Darren Eales was trying to say, and he explained everything very well, but he said if you're churning players, you create headroom. Headroom by he means that more money that you can then spend, and you then in turn can create more opportunity for investment. So that very much felt like the message from Darren Eales today, that Newcastle are going to have to trade. He was also asked by myself if Newcastle looked to the Saudi loan market in January, which I think many of us thought Newcastle would, given the fact that they desperately wanted those rules to not be upheld, and they wanted to ensure that Newcastle and other clubs could loan players from clubs that are owned dual by the same owners. So they essentially lobbied for that back in November, I think, and they managed the vote went in their favour. But according to Darren Eales, Newcastle are not planning, or certainly not at the moment, looking into loaning any players from Saudi Arabia, which came as a surprise to me, because I would be really surprised if they didn't look into that market this January, given the fact that there are plenty of decent players there that Newcastle could tap into and work a deal with the PIF, who of course own both them and the 4 Saudi Pro League clubs. But he said, look, they're not in the midst of anything at the moment, and he doesn't think that is the plan. So that was a little bit of a surprise to me. So look, not more questions and answers with regards to the January transfer window, but I think it will be mainly loans that Newcastle look at, and I would be surprised if they made a big money move on the back of what Darren Eales has got to say. And I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Still trying to sort of take it all in myself, and I'll bring you guys an update from Eddie Howe's press conference in the morning ahead of the Manchester City game. So leave your comments below, guys, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Cheers now.